Welcome everyone to the Week 5 presentation for ME121, Human Anatomy and Physiology. Week 5 is kind of a special week, so I don't want to mislead you. In Week 5, we are focusing on 2 new chapters, but it's also important to focus on everything else we have talked about from Week 1 all the way up to this week. The reason for that is this week you have a midterm exam, and we'll talk about that a little bit more at the end of the presentation. So the new content that you're learning in Week 5 is Chapter 8, which focuses on the sensory receptors, as well as Chapter 9, which is focused on the endocrine system. Okay, there's a couple of terms I want you to know and also just some general information. So sense organs consist of sensory receptors and also other types of cells. That's kind of why we lump them in this unit. Also, we talked about the sense organs a little bit with the nervous unit. So you may have some pre-knowledge as to some of the sense organs, and that's fine. That's just great. A couple of terms to know. Stimulus. That's any detectable change in the internal or external environment. So a stimulus can be described as a sensory receptor that absorbs energy. Transduction is the next term I want you to be familiar with. Transduction is the process of converting the energy of a stimulus into electrical energy. And thermoreceptors, they respond to heat and cold. They're based on the type of energy source receptors transduce. The receptors are classified based on that. The thermoreceptor is one type of receptor. Next, we're going to talk about pain. Never an exciting thing to talk about, but also a necessary evil to be familiar with. So the greater the pain intensity, that means there's a greater frequency of action potentials working on it. There's also a term called referred pain that I want you to be familiar with. And referred pain, an example of that is a person who is experiencing heart pain will also have pain in the left arm. That is considered a referred pain. Moving right into our first sense organ, we're going to focus on the sense of smell first. Odorants is a term to know, and odorant is a chemical substance that stimulates chemoreceptors in the nasal cavity. And here we can see an odorant as a rose. Odors are detected by the olfactory epithelium. And remember, epithelium is just a type of tissue. Olfactory is going to be a term to remember and associate with the sense of smell or your nose. Taste. The taste buds are the organs of taste and are located within the papilla of the tongue and are scattered throughout the mouth as well as the pharynx. Taste receptors are made up of modified epithelial cells. Moving to our eye. Okay, so there's some structures here you definitely need to be familiar with. The eyelid protects the eye from foreign objects, and it's made up of the thinnest skin of the body lined with conjunctiva. The conjunctiva is a mucous membrane that lines the inner surface of the eyelid, and it folds back to cover the anterior surface of the eyeball except over the cornea. The iris is a thin, pigmented, smooth muscle that adjusts the amount of light entering the pupil, and the pupil is the black hole that we see in the center. So dim light stimulates the radial muscles and the pupil dilates, and bright light stimulates the circular muscles and the pupil constricts. Tears flow from the lacrimal ducts. So I want you to remember a lacrimal duct. It is not on the image that we see here. The lacrimal gland is. However, the duct is not shown there. Let's next look at a cross-section of our eye. I like this picture because you can really get a sense of where the structures are in terms of relation to one another. So the anterior chamber is found between the cornea and the iris, and the posterior chamber is between the iris and the vitreous body that houses the lens. It's making up the anterior chamber, which fills with aqueous humor. So aqueous humor fills that anterior cavity. The lens is the transparent elastic ball that lies at the rear of the anterior cavity of the eyeball, and the lens is pictured on here for you to see. The axons of the ganglion cells extend across the surface of the retina, and they unite to form the optic nerve, and we can see that coming out the posterior side of this cross section. The sclera is covered by the conjunctiva, and again, that conjunctiva is a moist mucous membrane that extends as a continuous lining of the inner layer of the eyelid. Next, we'll look at the walls of the eye. Just a pretty amazing structure, if you ask me. So the eye is a fluid-filled hollow sphere with 3 distinct layers. The outer fibrous layer is the transparent cornea at the front of the eye and the white sclera at the anterior of the eye. The optic nerve and blood vessels actually pierce the sclera at the posterior of the eye. The middle layer is the vascular tunic. It includes the coracoid coat, ciliary body, and the iris. A term I want you to know is accommodation. So the ability of the lens to adjust shape to facilitate focusing, that is known as accommodation. The last layer that we haven't touched on yet is the inner layer. So the inner layer consists of the retina, which contains the photoreceptors. The inner tunic covers the back of the eye to the ciliary body. For vision to occur, light must pass through the eye and form an image on the retina. That is important to remember. Next, let's look at the visual receptors. Are rods and cones. So there are 2 types of modified neurons that comprise the visual receptors. There are elongated rods and blunt-shaped cones. The rods are most sensitive to light, and they function in dim light. They produce black and white vision. The rods give less precise images because their axon branches converge onto fewer nerve fibers. The cones are what provide the sharp images and bright light, and they enable us to see color. Another term to know associated with vision is binocular vision. Binocular vision helps us judge distances and depth. Here you can see the T-Rex in comparison with the human, which I found kind of interesting. Next, we'll move to the ear. So the ear has an external, middle, and inner sections, and it provides the senses of hearing as well as equilibrium. The outer or external ear consists of the auricle, which collects sound, which then travels down to the external acoustic meatus. The meatus ends at the tympanic membrane or the eardrum that vibrates with the sound waves. The tympanic membrane or eardrum separates the middle and external ear. That is important. The middle ear, also known as the tympanic cavity, is an air-filled space housing the auditory ossicles. There are 3 auditory ossicles. They are the malleus, incus, and stapes. The tympanic membrane vibrates the malleus, which then vibrates the incus, and then the stapes. The stapes vibrates the fluid inside the oval window of the inner ear. So the auditory ossicles both transmit as well as amplify sound waves. The auditory tube, which is also known as the eustachian tube, connects the middle ear to the nasopharynx, which is the throat region. It helps to maintain equal air pressure on both sides of the eardrum. The inner ear is made up of a membranous labyrinth inside of an osseous labyrinth within the temporal bone. So the cochlea houses the organs of hearing, while the semicircular canals function in equilibrium. The sound receptors are actually located within the cochlea, and I do want you to remember that. The sound receptors are located within the cochlea. Nerve fibers actually carry impulses to the auditory cortices of the temporal lobe, where they are then interpreted. So let's look more about the transmission of sound through the ear. So this is a lot to remember, and we'll digest it, and then I'll talk about the most important part that I want you to get. Sound waves pass through the external auditory meatus and cause that tympanic membrane to vibrate. We talked about that already. In the middle ear, the malleus, incus, and stapes then amplify the vibrations. The oval window vibrates, and these vibrations are transmitted through the perilymph in the inner ear to the endolymph and cause the basilar membrane to vibrate. The hair cells in the organ of Corti are stimulated, and the cochlear nerve then transmits signals to the brain. So the receptors, this is the part I want you to remember. The receptors for hearing are the organs of Corti that are found in the cochlea. Next, we're going to talk about the structures of the endocrine system. All right, the endocrine system works with the nervous system to help maintain homeostasis. The system helps regulate growth, reproduction, the use of nutrients by cells, and fluid balance. The endocrine system is made up of cells, tissues, and organs that secrete chemical messengers called hormones into the body fluids. Hormones diffuse into the bloodstream and act on target cells some distance away. Endocrine glands, including the pituitary gland, thyroid gland, parathyroid glands, adrenal glands, pancreas, pineal gland, reproductive glands, which that includes the ovaries as well as the testes, the thymus gland, and other secreting tissues. That, in a nutshell, is your endocrine system. Neuroendocrine cells, that's a term I want you to know, are important because they link the nervous and the endocrine systems. They're called neuroendocrine cells. Hormones are steroids, amines, peptides, proteins, and glycoproteins. They can influence target cells even if they are only present in minute concentrations. Hormone concentrations are regulated by the level of substances in the blood only. Hormone secretion is typically regulated by negative feedback. And do remember that hormone secretion is regulated by negative feedback. Specific to steroid hormones, I want you to remember that they turn specific genes on or off. Steroid hormones are relatively small molecules that pass easily through the plasma membrane of a target cell. Next, we're going to focus on the pituitary gland. It tends to be the most complex, so bear with me. We're going to get the worst one done at the start. So the pituitary gland is attached to the base of the brain by a stalk called the infundibulum. And that connections, it connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. The anterior pituitary is just the anterior lobe of the pituitary, and the posterior pituitary is the posterior lobe. The pituitary gland secretes several different hormones, and it's called the master gland. The hypothalamus does control the activities of the pituitary. Looking specifically first at the anterior pituitary hormones. Growth hormone stimulates body cells to grow and reproduce. It also speeds the rate at which cells use carbohydrates and fats. Prolactin promotes milk production following the birth of an infant. Thyroid stimulating hormone controls the secretion of hormones from the thyroid gland. This hormone promotes synthesis and secretions of those thyroid hormones. Adrenocorticotrophic hormone, it's often abbreviated as ACTH. It controls the secretion of the hormones from the adrenal cortex. And then we have our gonadotrophins. Our gonadotrophins are our follicle stimulating hormone known as FSH and luteinizing hormone LH. And they affect both the male testes as well as the female ovaries. Next, let's look at the posterior pituitary hormones. This one's a lot easier. There's two. Antidiuretic hormone, often abbreviated ADH, produces its effect by causing the kidneys to conserve water. And oxytocin plays a role in childbirth by contracting the muscles in the uterine wall, and it also helps stimulate the release of milk from the breast. Let's now switch to the thyroid, parathyroid, and thymus. And here you can see their locations. The thyroid gland consists of two broad lobes connected by an isthmus. The thyroid gland is shaped like a shield. It lies anterior to the trachea and just below the larynx. Its cells produce two iodine-containing hormones, T3 and T4. Together, they regulate energy metabolism. So those two hormones increase the rate at which cells release energy from carbohydrates. They enhance protein synthesis, and they stimulate the breakdown and mobilization of lipids as well. Extrafollicular cells of the thyroid secrete calcitonin, which helps lower blood levels of calcium and phosphate ions when they are too high. There are some thyroid disorders I want you to be familiar with. Hypothyroidism is an underactive thyroid. Hyperthyroidism is an overactive thyroid. Cretinism is another term to be familiar with. It's caused by hypothyroidism. Extreme hypothyroidism during childhood results in a low metabolic rate and delayed mental and physical development, and that condition is what's known as cretinism. Next, let's look at the parathyroids. There are four tiny parathyroids that are located on the posterior of the thyroid. Parathyroid hormone, PTH, increases blood calcium ion concentration. It also decreases phosphate ion concentration. The thymus. It lies between the lungs under the sternum. It secretes thymosins that affect the production and differentiation of T lymphocytes that are important in immunity. This is an interesting fact about the thymus. It is largest in children and then shrinks with age. The thymus gland is critical in the development of the immune system. Moving to our pancreas next. So the pancreas secretes hormones as an endocrine gland and digestive juices to the digestive tract as an exocrine gland. The beta cells of the islets of Langerhans produce the hormone insulin. That is important to remember. When glucose concentrations become very high, the beta cells then secrete insulin. The insulin decreases the blood levels of glucose in the blood. Diabetes mellitus is caused by a deficiency in the hormone insulin. Next, we'll talk about the adrenal glands. So the adrenal glands sit atop the kidneys. They look like little caps. They're enclosed in a layer of adipose and connective tissues. The adrenal medulla secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream. That's important to remember. So the effects of those hormones resemble those of the sympathetic division of neurotransmitters of the same names, except these that we find in the adrenal medulla last up to 10 times longer when they are secreted as hormones. So they are used in times of stress for our fight or flight responses. The cells of the adrenal cortex produce over 30 different steroids, some of which are vital to survival, the most important of which are aldosterone, cortisol, and the sex hormones. The sex hormones from the adrenal cortex are primarily androgens. Aldosterone promotes the homeostasis of ions by causing the kidneys to conserve sodium and excrete potassium. Cortisol is the main glucocorticoid. It's produced by the cells of the middle layer. It also influences the metabolism of glucose, protein, and fat in response to conditions of stress where the body requires a greater supply of energy in the bloodstream. All right, let's talk briefly about your midterm exam. I know it can be a stressful time, and I want you all to do well, so I want you to make sure you prepare accordingly. It covers everything from week 1 through week 5. It has more questions on it. There will be 50 questions, so make sure when you're taking it you allot enough time. It is worth a heavy point total. It is worth 150 points. That means it's going to make a huge impact on your grade. It can make a positive impact, which is what we want, or it can make a negative impact if you're not prepared. So please make sure to prepare accordingly. At this point, do make sure you read through the chapters in their entirety. Ask questions if you have them. Do remember all the information presented today did come from your textbook. Thank you so much for your time and have a great week.